I want to start with a sentence that took me years to understand. Some wounds don't heal when you get an apology. Some wounds only heal when you stop waiting for one. Now, before anybody gets upset, I'm not saying apologies don't matter. They do. Acknowledgement matters. Accountability matters. Repair matters. If you've been following this series, you've probably noticed something. A lot of healing has very little to do with changing your parents, and a lot more to do with changing your relationship with reality. Because you've reached a point where you've tried understanding them. You've looked at their childhood. You've looked at their parents. You've looked at the patterns that were passed down through generations. You've moved beyond blame. You've thought carefully about repairing the relationship. And then you find yourself standing in front of a wall of questions that nobody really prepares you for. What if this is just who they are? What if they never fully understand me? What if they never apologize? What if they never become the parent I hoped they would be? And honestly, I think this is where some of the deepest healing begins, because this is where grief begins. When people hear the word grief, they usually think about death. But grief shows up in all kinds of places. Sometimes grief is mourning something you never had. Sometimes it's mourning something you thought you would eventually get. I think one of the hardest forms of grief is grieving the parent you wish existed. The parent who always understood. The parent who always knew what to say. The parent who made you feel safe. The parent who saw you clearly. Who could meet you where you were. For years, I didn't realize I was grieving. I thought I was just frustrated, disappointed, and angry. And some of that was true, but underneath all of that was grief. Because there was a version of the relationship I kept hoping for. And every time reality didn't match up to that hope, it hurt. One of the hardest things I've had to admit is that sometimes hope can keep us stuck. Not all hope, but a certain kind of hope. The hope that says, if I explain it one more time, if I find the perfect words, if I become successful enough, if I become lovable enough, if I become easy enough, then maybe they'll finally understand. Maybe then I'll get what I've been looking for all along. And listen, I don't want to say this with judgment. I lived there for years. I think a lot of us do, especially those of us who became high achievers. Because high achievers are often secretly bargaining. We're still trying to earn something. We're still trying to earn approval, recognition, love, validation, that shiny gold star, the emotional equivalent of perfect attendance. At some point, we're told that life was a game, and we're still trying to win that game, even though it ended a long time ago. But what we have to realize is that grief asks us to stop playing that game. I think people hear this topic and assume that I'm talking about giving up. I'm not. Grieving is not giving up. It's accepting reality. There is a difference. Giving up sounds like,
this relationship is hopeless.
Grieving sounds like,
this relationship may never be what I want it to be.
One is despair and the other is acceptance. And acceptance is surprisingly powerful because acceptance frees us from constantly arguing with reality. I spent years wishing certain things about my parents were different. And some of those things never changed. Not because they were bad, not because they didn't care, but because they had limitations, just like all of us do. The moment I stopped expecting them to become someone else was the moment I finally started seeing them clearly. One thing I've noticed throughout this entire process is that healing often involves shrinking our parents back down to size. When we were children, our parents felt enormous. They were the center of our world. Then we're adults, and somehow they're still enormous. Their opinions still carry weight. Their approval still matters. Their criticism still stings. And their disappointment still hurts. But something changes. You start seeing them as people, not symbols, not heroes, not villains, but people. People who were shaped by their own experiences. People who got some things right, and people who got some things wrong. People who loved imperfectly, who were loved imperfectly. And strangely enough, that's when compassion becomes possible. Not because their mistakes disappeared, because they didn't, but because reality replaces fantasy. This is one of the reasons why I started this channel. Because many high achieving women spent years carrying expectations, responsibilities, and emotional burdens that were never fully examined. The work isn't just about learning how to do less. It's learning how to see more clearly your patterns, your family, your relationships, and ultimately yourself. If that resonates with you, click on that little subscribe button down below. Something else surprised me during this process. The more I healed my overfunctioning, the more grief I encountered. I know that sounds backwards. You'd think healing would feel lighter immediately, but it often doesn't, because overfunctioning can be a way of avoiding grief. If I'm busy enough, I don't have to feel disappointed. If I'm fixing everything, I don't have to feel helpless. If I'm achieving, producing, organizing, managing, and carrying everyone else, I don't have to sit still long enough to acknowledge what hurts. But eventually, the nervous system slows down. And when it does, grief often walks right into the room. Not to destroy us, but to free us. Because grief helps us let go of what isn't real. And many of us have spent years holding on to relationships that existed more in hope than in reality. So, I have an exercise for you. So take out a notebook, and on a page, I want you to write your answer to the following questions. What kind of parent did I actually have? What kind of parent did I wish I had? What have I been hoping to receive from them? Am I still waiting for an apology, understanding, approval, or recognition? Then, I want you to ask yourself, if that never happens, who do I become? Don't rush that question. Sit with it. Because hidden inside of that question is a tremendous amount of freedom. The goal isn't to stop wanting things. The goal is to stop building your future around whether someone else can provide them. I think most people view grief as something that is taken away. But grief also gives something back. It gives us reality. And reality gives us choice. When we stop chasing the parent we wish we had, we can finally decide how to relate to the parent we actually have. Sometimes that leads to greater closeness. Sometimes that leads to stronger boundaries. Sometimes it leads to peace. But all of those outcomes are built on reality, not fantasy. And reality is where healing lives. As we've gone through this series, we've talked about understanding your parents. We've talked about moving beyond blame. We've talked about inheriting survival strategies. And we've talked about repair. But underneath all of those conversations is one final lesson. Your healing cannot depend on someone else becoming who you need them to be. At some point, every adult faces the same invitation: to see their parents clearly, to see themselves clearly, and to grieve the gap between what was and what could have been. Not because grief is the end of healing, because grief is often what makes healing possible. Once we stop waiting for the past to change, we can finally begin building a future. And that, I think, is one of the hardest and most beautiful parts of growing up. All right. Thank you for watching this series, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.